Il était une fois, il y avait un groupe de personnes qui concouraient.
Kat, can you tell this story in English, please?
Alright, fine.
Beep!
Once upon a time, in the 11th century, a band of brave men, commonly known as the Normans, conquered the lands of Europe after the King of England, Edward the Confessor, died without an heir. Edward's cousin, William of Normandy, had a legitimate claim to the throne, but
Wait, this is about France, not Normandy.
okay, well, Normandy had been a part of France for nearly 200 years by then. Stop interrupting, Hadley. Anyway, instead of William taking the throne, the Anglo-Saxons chose one of their own to take over. A man called Henry of Wessex became the king, and William and Henry fought over the crown in 1066. William and Henry were fully prepped for battle when another man with claim to the throne arrived in the north. Harold Hardrada of Norway fought with Henry in the bloody battle at Stamford Bridge. By the time Henry and his men arrived to fight with William and his army of 5,000, the Anglo-Saxons were all very tired. The Anglo-Saxons still fought a good fight, which became known as the Battle of Hastings. The Normans were victorious, having groups fake retreat and then attacking sections of the Anglo-Saxon army. After winning this battle, William became known as William the Conqueror. After the Normans took over, they rebuilt the English government, creating a carefully thought-out feudal system that prevented the elites from gaining a lot of power. He made every freeman take an oath of loyalty to the king, not their feudal lords. The Normans built hundreds of castles to guard against inner rebellions and external threats.
Another group of people influenced the English language, the Scandinavian Vikings. When the Vikings invaded England in the 8th to 9th century, they were seen as distant relatives by the English because of their similar Germanic heritage. The conquering Vikings were lower-class farmers and merchants. The Vikings also married English commoners, and so words from Old Norse permeated the lower class. These factors all allowed the Vikings to assimilate well into English society. Many of these words influence the verb forms and pronouns in modern English today.
After the Vikings came the Norman invasion. The Norman invasion not only had a huge impact on the societal and political structure of the country, but also the language. The people who had been living there now had a new body that controlled them, and in order for things to work, they had to communicate. This communication had to begin at the highest level, with the nobles and high officers. Once the language began to trickle down to the officials who were first with everyday people, peasants had to work with the language to work with their masters.
Oh yeah, and because English was the language of the working people, and in particular people of lumber trades, English became a very simple language. A fun fact is that although Old English only constitutes of about 1% of the Oxford English Dictionary, much of it is very functional and is used in our everyday lives. Words such as man, wife, brother, sister, live, fight, love, and etc. all come from Old English. This is largely because peasants all spoke English and so the language remained. Not just everyday objects remained, but many of our prepositions and most of our connector words such as to, for, but, and, at, in, and on also come from Old English. Because English is a collaboration of many languages, we have a much more vast vocabulary. Although words like the Old English term motherhood are in the English language, we also have words from French such as maternity.
Because the Norman French invaders were nobles and upperclassmen who took away their property, invaded their land, and did not have Germanic origin like the Scandinavians, the French did not assimilate well like the Vikings did. Because they were nobles, French was a language of aristocracy, and not many of the lower class knew.
And when the lower classmen finally did learn French, it was purely functional. By that time, the upperclassmen had incorporated the language into everyday speech. While they did not completely give up the English language, many words were substituted into the common language. This was seen as classier, more attractive, and possibly a more educated way of speaking. So high-class vocabulary was in French, whereas the more everyday language was in English. For example, Animals in the field were called by English names, such as sheep, cow, etc. But what was cooked was given French names, such as beef, mutton, and veal.
Even words that already had an English equivalent were passed down. For example, eat and dine being pretty much the same thing, right? They both refer to the act of ingesting food. However, dine came from French, and now we use it to refer to the more sophisticated act of eating.
Although the lines between the two languages may seem pretty harsh, soon this way of speaking spread down the classes until almost all spoke a mix of English and French.
Being a language spoken only by the upperclassmen, French loaned words to English that mainly had to do with nobility, government, and cultural elite aspects of society. With the use of loanwords from Norman French, there were more synonyms that made the English language more flexible and equipped it with a larger vocabulary. This was different from the Vikings' influence on English, which consisted of verb forms and pronouns as well as impact on pronunciation with common words due to the conquering Vikings' lower class status.
Guys, we've forgotten one key thing. Norman French isn't like Parisian French at all that's seen as the standard today. For one thing, Parisian French doesn't include the sound w, so words that in Norman French that were pronounced with the qu sound in Parisian French are pronounced with the hard k sound. For example, because English is influenced by Norman French, we pronounce the word spelled Q-U-E-S-T-I-O-N as question, whereas in Parisian French it's pronounced as question. Additionally, the Normans use the suffixes arie and orie, whereas French use aire and oire. So words in English such as victory in French are victoire.
The Normans incorporated a lot of prefixes and suffixes into English, but these did not come from pure French. The Norman people were actually descendants of Vikings. There, they spoke Old Norse until they got rid of it and adapted French. They used a rural dialect of French, which had a heavy Germanic influence. This created what we now call Anglo-Norman or Norman French, the language that English nobles used for over 300 years. Here are some examples in which French made its way into English. Skillful professions adopted French titles like mason, painter, and tailor. Cooked animals adopted French names like sheep to mutton, swine to pork, cow to beef, etc. The most words that came into English dealt with courts and nobility, like crown, castle, prince, count, duke, and parliament.
Everyone knows that the official language of England today is English, so when did people start writing things in English again?
Well, to answer that question, I have to go back to when the Normans first took over. When the Normans took over, French and Latin became the language of the elites. Because only the elites knew how to write, all written records from the time after the Norman invasion in 1066 were written in French and Latin. During the so-called gap, when English was not written down or spoken by the elites, French and Latin became the proper language. Around 200 years after the Norman conquest, English once again emerged as the official language of England. There were several factors that made this change happen. First, after 1204, when King John lost the French part of Normandy to the King of France, Norman nobles were forced to move to their English properties. Because of this move, the Norman nobles became increasingly out of touch with their French properties and started to think of themselves as English. Another factor was the Hundred Years' War, that lasted from 1337 to 1543. This war against France made French seem like the language of the enemy, and people became more loyal to their original language, English. A third factor was the Black Death in 1349. The Black Death killed an unproportional number of Latin-speaking clergy, causing the English-speaking working class to grow up in economic and social importance, thus bringing back the importance of English.
Wait, so when did English officially become the language of England again?
That's a great question, Anna. In 1362, the Statute of Pleading made English the official language of courts and parliaments in England. It was ironic, though, because the document was still written in French. In 1385, English became the official language of schools. When English came back to life, though, it was much different than it had been before it died out. This new version of English was called Middle English, which emerged from Old English, the language before the Norman conquest. An important difference between Old and Middle English is the large amount of French vocab integrated into the new language. During the Norman rule, everything was written in French because only the educated elites could write. So it makes sense that when English re-emerged, the writers that used to write in French switched to English. But sometimes those writers could not find an English word to describe what they wanted to say, so they would just substitute a word that they already knew in French. These French words eventually got used so much that they became words in the English language.
Isn't Chaucer a famous writer from that period?
Yes, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales was the first great work of English literature after the re-immersion of English. Chaucer used 500 different words from French in his writing, but his writing is still deemed a re-emerged version of English.
English, like almost everything else in this world, has had many influences, and the language we speak today is still developing. Our language is quite a bit like us, growing, changing, and learning new things. It tells tales of love and tragedy. Some of its relatives have died out, but many of English's roots still thrive, growing and changing along with it. French, among many other languages, doesn't get the credit it deserves for its significant influence on English, or its ability to help us all communicate our way to a happily ever after. The end.